Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. How does a weary world rejoice? Today is the first Sunday of Advent. Joshua, Gideon, Meredith, and William lit our Advent candle for us this morning. The first candle, the candle of hope. And each week this month we will light one more candle for peace, for joy, for love, leading us finally to Christmas Eve, when we will light that final candle, the Christ candle, and once again proclaim the good news, joy to the world. The Lord is come. But I am getting ahead of myself because today we are still waiting. Today we are still singing songs of exile, of waiting, of hoping, of longing for Christ to come. Today we cry with the prophet Isaiah in the second reading we heard this morning, "Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down," because we're tired, we're weary. We are spent, used up, in need of Christ's gift of hope. Come, thou long-expected Jesus, indeed, the world has grown weary for the waiting. This year, our congregation is reading an Advent devotional together, and it is called, How Does a Weary World Rejoice? Maybe you recognize the title. It's from the line in that Christmas carol, Holy Night. A thrill of hope, a weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. You'll have to wait until Christmas Eve to hear the rest. It sounds nice though, right? It's poetic. But we are, every one of us, weary. And how does a weary world rejoice? In today's gospel lesson, Luke introduces us to two people who are also weary. Zechariah and Elizabeth. They are an old, faithful couple who have tried all their lives but been unable to have children. And they've lived their lives holding on to a grief, to an emptiness that they're afraid to voice. Until one day, while going about his usual temple duties, Zechariah encounters the angel Gabriel, proclaiming good news. God has heard your prayer, and your wife Elizabeth will have a son. His name will be John, and he will prepare the way for the one who is to come. Zechariah cannot believe his ears, and he says as much. He says, "How can we have a child? We are too old." And Gabriel tells him that because he did not believe, he will be struck silent, unable to speak. And so he is. But Elizabeth conceives, and she believes that the Lord is at work. Now, I've got a little issue here with Luke's Advent story, because he is not exactly consistent. An angel appears to Zechariah. He tells him about an impossible birth. Zechariah asks, how? And he is chided for not believing. But then right after this, and the story we'll read next week, the same angel Gabriel will appear to Mary, and he'll tell her about an impossible birth, Jesus, and Mary will ask how, and she will be lifted up as a paragon of faith. In fact, every time an angel shows up in the Bible and announces a miraculous birth, someone asks, but how can this be? So tell me, Luke, why is Zechariah over here getting the short end of the stick? It could be that the man just understands basic biology. I wonder what Zechariah's silence has to say to us about Our Weariness. I wonder if we've been reading the story just a little bit wrong. Interpreters often tell us that Zechariah's silence is a punishment for his lack of faith. But that's not quite what the text says. Yes, Zechariah's silence does come as a consequence of his unbelief, but maybe that's not God's doing. Maybe that's just the natural outgrowth of weariness. The normal human response to fear and disbelief. He hears the good news, but it's so unbelievable and far-fetched. What use is it really to get everyone's hopes up? We've been in that position, haven't we? We don't know what to say, so we end up saying nothing. Maybe Zechariah's silence is exactly what happens when we become isolated by our fear and our weariness. Fear, sadness, loneliness, weariness, these things do have a way of isolating us, don't they? Of making us feel like we're all alone. We feel weary, but everyone else seems to have it together, so we must be unique in our troubles. To quote that great theological giant Taylor Swift, it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. Left unattended, these feelings can become toxic, corrosive. They eat away bit by bit at our sense of ourselves, our connection to one another, our trust that God is at work in the world, and that we could have a role to play in God's great plan of salvation. Leave it to fester, and this weariness will swallow us whole. It will overcome us even as we try to push it back by putting our heads down and powering through, telling everyone we're fine, thanks. But we're not. We're weary. We are so very weary. Still today, we light a candle of hope. For there is hope, even in deep weariness. There is hope in our weariness, because I'll tell you this. In the 7 years that I have been your pastor, you will have taught me something very important about weariness. You have taught me that my weariness, even my very particular forms of weariness, are utterly un-unique. Several times in our years together, I've come to you and I've admitted pieces of my own weariness, my humanness, and each time you've responded the same way. You've said, me too. When I said to you, I'm getting divorced, several of you said, oh, me too. I've gone through that. When I told y'all I live with mental illness, several of you said, yeah, me too. When I said to you, my spouse is an alcoholic and it's chaos, you said, yeah, I know, me too. When I told y'all I was gay, several of y'all said, yep, me too. Every time, y'all, I have found myself in grief or in fear. When I've said out loud, I'm struggling and I don't know what to do, you have said, me too. Me too, I've been there, I've gone through that. I'm going through that right now. And yet somehow every time, we were all surprised by these encounters, right? Because we all thought that everyone else had it together. And I can't help but thinking, friends, do you think part of why we are so weary is that we spend so much time trying to pretend that we're not? Like Zechariah, weary people become isolated. Like Zechariah, weary people become afraid. Afraid to let down our guard, afraid to admit to our weariness, afraid even to let ourselves hope in the promise of good news. Alone, in our weariness, we fall silent. But weariness shared loses some of its power, doesn't it? There is solidarity, there is recognition, there is even reason for hope. So friends, let's say it. We're tired. We're weary. Life is hard, the world can be cold, and things are not as they should be, could be. What if we stopped trying to hide that from ourselves and one another? What if we named it? Gave ourselves and everyone else a chance to say, yeah, me too. So how does a weary world rejoice? We acknowledge our weariness. We say it out loud, we're not okay. For to voice our weariness is to practice hope. And know this, weariness does not get the last word in our stories. Thanks be to God.
Amen.